let's bring in Dr. Jason Johnson, political science professor at Morgan State University and MSNBC contributor. Good morning, Doctor.
MS Now.
MS Now. Oh my gosh. I need to get hip.
Dr. J, it's been a long time.
It has been too long.
Been a long time. I should have missed you.
Yeah.
I will say this. It was a very interesting weekend in Washington, D.C. And as someone who has been to several White House Correspondents Dinner, I was not at this particular one. The aftermath of this weekend's activities have led to some of the most interesting times I've seen in D.C. and in American media in the last 10 or 12 years.
Well, explain that.
That's my top line.
Okay, yeah. Explain that. So what was different?
So first off, and I've said this, on my own streaming channel, I think it's very important to say up front, because everybody's been chewing over this, you should never attribute to conspiracy what can be explained by incompetence. Right? Like, there's a lot of people out there saying, oh my gosh, it's a false flag. This was fake. It was Trump, and he was trying to do this so he could get a ballroom. We don't have any evidence of that. Right? And so, that's going down a tinfoil hat rabbit hole. What we do know is that by the latest reporting, and I just saw this earlier this morning, this was massively incompetent. The Secret Service, they shot at this guy 5 times and apparently missed. Like, when he fell over, they thought they had shot him. No, Cole Allen, the shooter, actually slipped and fell on his own. There was no outside security. They didn't have QR codes on the tickets. I know people who went there who were saying, like, this is really weird. There was no good security this year. You usually can't get anywhere near that hotel for like 2 blocks, right? They won't let you near the hotel without a room key, without a ticket. So it looks to me like it was massive incompetence. And I'm not surprised that the Trump administration uses any incident as a way to push whatever agenda it is they have. But I'll tell you, as of right now, I'm not on conspiracies on them. There's plenty of things that I think are questionable this administration has done, and I wouldn't put it past them to try. But you can't, on the one hand, say that these people are incompetent at war, the economy, healthcare, and everything else like that, but they're somehow sophisticated enough to pull off a false flag of Flint that somehow didn't work one way or another.
Dr. Jason Johnson, I have seen, and by the way, I made it, did it on purpose to not talk to you about this until on the show. Right? I did it on purpose. But I've seen a lot of your friends were at this Correspondents Dinner. Bring us behind the curtains a little bit. What are they saying? What are they saying about being inside of that room?
Thank you for putting it that way, G. So I won't put anyone's names out there. Here's the thing. And I've talked to several people who are actually there. The universal thing that I hear from people who are there is, one, really the security was bad, right? It's usually very, very difficult to be in it. And you and Ursula, anyone who's ever been to a concert, anyone who's ever been backstage, you've been to a Super Bowl, I've been to a Super Bowl, you know what normal security looks like. This did not look like normal security. I was hearing that from people privately in text messages before anybody said anything on television, anybody said anything on the radio. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I hear mixed reports about what it was actually like in the room, right? Because some people are saying, yeah, we heard a loud noise, but then everybody had out their cell phone cameras as we're taking pictures. And then other people are talking as if like, oh, this is terrifying, blah, blah, blah. I can tell you this because I was not in the room and I hear different things. I have marched with protesters in Baltimore after Freddie Gray when cops were out there. I was in Ferguson. I got tear gas. I saw people get shot. I saw police cars on fire. I have marched with government protesters against the government in Mexico when people were unhappy about an election result. I have been in dangerous environments before, and I'm not a war correspondent. So I can't speak to how people felt in that room, but I will tell you that most people who I spoke to were like, there was more confusion than actual fear behind the scenes in the room at the time.
You are listening to Dr. Jason Johnson, and one of the questions comes from one of our listeners, Robin Puyallup, who says, do you think it was, you've brought up incompetence by Secret Service. Is that intentional or just what is currently going on in this administration?
So here's what I think is interesting about that. You know how hard it is to act stupid if you're not stupid? You know how hard it is to pretend that you can't swim? You know how hard it is to pretend that you can't ride a bike? It is harder to pretend to be incompetent than it is to actually be incompetent. I think we do ourselves a disservice as a public when we turn an administration that, again, has been shown to not know how to manage a war, not know how to manage the economy, not know figure out how to manage healthcare, who just fired the entire National Science Board, right? It's hard to then say these people who have shown themselves to be incompetent in government at so many different levels are somehow sophisticated enough to pull this off. That doesn't click for me. And like I said, there's lots of things this administration does that are questionable, but I don't think you can pretend to be stupid at this level. I mean, we have reports from The Atlantic this week, and several people now confirming The Atlantic's reports, that Kash Patel allegedly shows up to work drunk, can't figure out his own computer. You're telling me that guy and this NSA and this FBI figured out how to make someone travel across the country and not be successful? I don't buy it.
Yeah.
Well,
and there's a lot of stuff I buy. I don't buy this.
By the way, there are competent people that can go to work and not figure out their computer. I'm people. Hey, real quick, you know what really I'm being serious. Hey, you know what stood out to me, Dr. Johnson, and this is something that I didn't bring up to Ursula. I haven't brought up to anyone. Mm-hmm. I find something interesting, and help us understand something. Some of the folks in the room that cannot stand this administration, that cannot stand Donald Trump, the Don Lemons of the world and all the folks, right? I mean, they taking pictures and selfies and and all this stuff. So help me better understand the people that talk crazy and ridiculous about Donald Trump and his administration. Why were they there? Were they there to take pictures for the gram, or were they there because, tell us why.
So in theory, right, and it's a perfect example of this, like I said, on my YouTube, I have a picture of me going to White House Correspondents Dinner. It's me, Michael Steele, a bunch of black Republicans, right? I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. So in theory, the way the White House Correspondents Dinner used to work, you remember those old like Looney Tunes cartoons where it was Wile E. Coyote and the sheepdog? And it's like they spent the whole cartoon trying to kill each other. And then at the end, they would clock out and they would have lunch together. That's what it used to be. It used to be, despite how antagonistic the relationship can be between the press, between Democrats and Republicans, it's the one night, it's nerd prom. Everybody gets together, they're friendly, they chat, and then you go back to your separate corners. Okay. That's what it used to be.
Right.
Until you had a president come into office who refers to journalists as enemy of the state, until you had a president come into office whose DOJ is constantly trying to arrest reporters for doing their work. And so what happened this particular weekend is I know a number of journalists who frankly were like, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go because I will not be in a room that in any shape, way, or form validates or legitimizes this administration. Now, I know other people who went and were like, look, I'm not here for Trump. I'm not here for J.D. Vance. I'm not here for Kash Patel. I'm here because I believe in what the White House Correspondents Association does, and we have to maintain that institution. So I can't speak to Don Lemon or anybody specifically, but I know that there were multiple motivations behind people going. And some people felt it was very important to continue the tradition of how the Correspondents' Dinner is supposed to work. And I know some other people who are like, we don't even have a comedian this year because the president is so thin-skinned. And by the way, I know this joke's have been made 1,000 times, but I don't know how you can have a future predicting mentalist at this event who couldn't figure out what was going to happen. But they didn't even have a comedian this year because Donald Trump is so thin-skinned, right? So I know some people who didn't want to go. I know some people who did go. I don't have any specific judgments of them because I don't know every person's individual motivation for why they were at the dinner.
Sure.
Okay, well, you brought up a little bit earlier, you brought up the war and what is going on with that. So I just was looking, and there's no indication from the administration on how long the U.S. blockade of the Strait of Hormuz might continue. The events of this past weekend kind of took the war in some ways out of the headlines. But what is your take on what is going on with the war in Iran?
So this is something important, Ursula. Thanks for asking this. I tell people this all the time. I tell them on the air, I tell them stream, tell them writing, whatever, tell them in class. Don't listen to non-experts when it comes to foreign policy. I am not a foreign policy expert. I am a domestic policy expert. So when you hear people who want to get online and say, oh, well, this is happening. Do you speak Farsi? Do you know the intricacies? No, you don't, right? But here's what I can say is happening domestically. And here's what I can say is what's happening amongst our allies, because this is information of people who I am in contact with. Every single other nation that we are ostensibly allied with is punching air right now because they think that the war was unnecessary. The war has not been successful. The methodologies and reasons for the war seem to be changing week after week. And every single time President Trump jumps on Truth Social and claims there's another deadline, there's another extension, they've agreed to this, and the Iranians then mock him with Legos, it diminishes our status internationally. And this is not the first time this has happened. Just 6 months ago, remember, the same thing was happening with Ukraine and Russia. The president was announcing domestically, hey, Zelensky has to agree to this brand new deal by Thanksgiving. They don't celebrate Thanksgiving in Ukraine. These deadlines don't mean anything to these other countries. It's insane. So what I can tell you is this. The war is not going well because we never found out why we were supposed to do it to begin with. The Iranian government is still just as powerful as they used to be. Our allies don't trust us. And I don't know about y'all, but I was driving north of Los Angeles last week, and I was going to a screening of the Michael Jackson movie. I'm an hour north of Los Angeles, and I had to pay for gas that was $7 a gallon. And that wasn't happening before this war. So when I tell you that domestically, the consequences of this war are going to resonate for months and months and months and possibly years, that's what ultimately matters. And the buck stops with this thoroughly incompetent administration.
You listen to the voice of Dr. Jason Johnson here on the Gee and Ursula Show. We got about 5 minutes, and boy, did that Michael Jackson strike me in a second. But the Supreme Court right now limits the reach of Voting Rights Act ahead of the midterms. It's a 6-3 Supreme Court decision out of Louisiana. First, set it up for the people who might not know what's going on. That's number one. And number two, explain to us what this means going forward.
Very simply, the Supreme Court said we can go back to Jim Crow. You don't have to be a legal scholar. You don't have to be an expert. It said you can go back to Jim Crow. The Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was created because it was very clear for 120-something years in American history that you had certain parts of the country where the legislatures were going to consistently cut and draw districts to dilute or completely eliminate the ability of non-white people to actually be represented. That's what was happening. And so you had a bunch of court cases in the 50s and the 60s, and the Supreme Court finally said, all right, look, you've got to make sure that you write these or cut these voting districts in a way that you can't completely eliminate black voters in the South. You can't completely eliminate this group of people or that group of people. And whenever we look at one of your redrawing of these districts, we're going to try to see if this could look like racial discrimination. They have now thrown that out. They got rid of pre-clearance years ago. They've now thrown it away. So what does this mean at a practical level for every single person listening? It completely depends on what state you're in. Now, if you're in one of these states in the South, it basically means if you've had a primary already, then you're fine. Your current voting districts are going to be fine heading into the midterm elections. But if you're in a place like Tennessee, South Carolina, I believe Georgia, if you're in any of these other states, it is possible now for the state legislator to completely redraw every single district, eliminate every single black elected official if they want to, and that would be completely legal as far as this Supreme Court is concerned. So it's bad. It is as bad as everyone says it is. And what people should be doing right now is making sure that they're informing themselves of their rights if you're in one of the 6 or 7 states that is yet to have a primary. Now, conceivably, that could happen in Washington, Oregon, whatever else, because not all these states have necessarily had their primaries, but you don't really have to worry in California or Oregon or Washington that the state legislator is going to try and eliminate all AAPI voters or eliminate all Latino voters or eliminate all black voters. But we have a history of that in the South. And we have a history of that being shown even recently in the South, and that's why this is a horrible ruling.
Dr. Johnson, we've got like about a minute. There is a perception, and maybe it's the reality, that Democrats don't have a clear message right now. And going into the midterms, what are the Democrats, what should they be focusing on as the administration and the control of the Republicans of both houses and basically the Supreme Court? I mean, going into the midterms, are the Democrats doing any better or doing any kind of messaging? Because right now it doesn't seem to be landing.
So here's the thing. By every single statistical measure right now, the Democrats are ahead by 5 or 6 points on the congressional generic ballot. People are unhappy with the Republican Party. They're going to vote for the Democratic Party. that seems the most likely outcome. And in fact, you now have races in North Carolina and Ohio that are competitive. I push back on this notion about messaging because, quite frankly, I think that most Americans don't need a coherent message. You need one during a presidential election because you're voting for an individual. But when it comes to the midterm elections, the message is what's happening locally. I don't think a Democrat in Texas, James Talarico doesn't have to sound like, Roy Cooper in North Carolina. AOC isn't going to sound like Mamdani. I think the idea, because Republicans don't have a coherent message either. I think that when it comes to midterms, you really just have to pay attention to what are people saying in your particular state to address your needs. I think the idea of coherent messaging is a myth that inside DC people like to promote because it's an easy way to sort of fearmonger, but it's not how people actually vote in their states.
Dr. Jason Johnson, we appreciate you, and we only got we don't even have any time left, but
you can slip one more in. You can get in one more question.
Yeah, I mean, Ursula and I, we talked about the Michael Jackson stuff yesterday.
Gee said he's not going to go watch.
I'm not watching, and I want to know why you went to watch.
Gee, you know why I went to watch, because I am partnered with someone who is a huge fan, and she rented out an entire theater for friends and family to see. So would you rent out, or would she rent out, or they rent out an entire theater to go see an OJ movie? She probably would not. You're trying to get me in trouble.
Okay. All right. Look, how about this? Can we agree that there is a real big hypocrisy when it comes to MJ? Can we agree?
I will say that there are a lot of things about his story that there are still people in conflict about whether or not they happened or how they happened. And I think that is a fair reason for anyone to not go see anything. I mean, I honestly believe that. And you know full well, I am more of a Prince person than a Michael Jackson person. And had I not had an emotional and relationship obligation to show up, I probably wouldn't have gone.
You just here so you don't. You was just there so you don't get. You was just there so you don't get fined.
Basically, yeah, I was there so I don't get fined. There's a pure Marshawn Lynch from. It was a Marshawn movie.